Is Weekly Shonen Jump canceling too many series too soon? Stay tuned. So if you've been reading manga from Shonen Jump's app over the past couple of years, you've probably had at least one series, probably more than one, that you've really been enjoying all of a sudden become unceremoniously canceled. For me personally, the ones that hurt the worst were Phantom Seer and Hard-Boiled Cop and Dolphin. I was greatly enjoying both of these series. I wanted to see nothing but success for them. I enjoyed the characters, I enjoyed the settings, the stories. Everything was great about both of these. And then all of a sudden they ended. And it was worse to me for Phantom Seer because I had no idea that series was coming to a close. So I read that final chapter not knowing that I was about to read the final chapter. On the other hand, Hard-Boiled Cop and Dolphin, I had heard people saying it was going to get canceled. So by the time it happened, I kind of prepared myself for the worst, and it was okay. But with a recent round of cancellations, series like Red Hood and Neru getting canceled, it's brought a lot of people out wondering why so many series are getting canceled in the magazine lately, and why they're not making it very far. Why are they getting canceled so soon, not even hitting 20 chapters in some cases? So whenever these things happen, I do often get people asking me my opinion on it. And with that, I did get someone asking me just the other day on one of my TikTok videos, what do you think about Red Hood getting canceled, and how do you feel about how many titles are getting canceled in the magazine now? And I responded in the way that I typically do. I said, I don't think that it's any less typical than what's happened in the magazine ever before. I think that the number of series being canceled and how quickly they get canceled is pretty much within the typical range. And this seems to be kind of an unpopular opinion because a lot more people think the opposite, that this is odd, that there shouldn't be so many series canceled, because how is anyone supposed to actually succeed if they're barely given any room to breathe? How is a new creator supposed to succeed if they have to worry about having their series cut off by chapter 20, if not earlier? And I've seen so many people come up with this argument that if One Piece were to debut in the magazine anytime in the past couple of years, that it probably wouldn't have made it to chapter 20 either. It would have been canceled before it really got to expand on anything. But I don't think that that's true. I don't think that that's true, but I've never really had the evidence to support my argument against those statements. I've just stated my opinion on it, and I've stated it pretty confidently, but I've never stated it with any sort of evidence or numbers behind it. And recently I decided that I wanted to kind of get those numbers. Not because I wanted to be able to state that I was correct, which that's fun, like it's nice to find out if I'm right about something or not, but because I wanted to just find out what is typical for the magazine. What is typical for the number of series canceled each year? What's typical for the amount of chapters that these series actually reach before they're canceled? And so I sat down, and over the course of a few days, I gathered all of the information. I went back to 1968 and looked at every single title that has been published in the Weekly Shonen Jump magazine since its debut. And yes, that is a lot of series. There are a ton of series that have been published in the magazine, and a majority of them were canceled pretty quickly. So I looked through all the series and I took note of every series that was canceled within a year of its debut. And I know the first thing that you're thinking is most of these series don't even make it to half a year, let alone a whole year. And yes, you are absolutely correct, but I wanted to have a larger sample size to work off of, and honestly it was easier for me to see which ones ended within a year for my first pass through of all this data. So I compiled all of that information. I made a graph showing us how many titles were canceled each year from 1968 to 2021. And before I show you the graph, I'm just going to say I don't really pay attention to 2021 because we don't have full information from this year yet. And I also don't really want to pay attention to the first few years of the magazine because they were really formative years. And the numbers that you see here are not really representative of what would happen throughout the rest of the magazine. So let's take a look at the graph. So you can see from 1970 exactly what I'm talking about. 1970 had 27 canceled titles, and that no year even gets close to that after that point. So I decided to ignore those first 3 years because, like I said, it's a formative period for the magazine, but after this point you can see that things kind of level out. From 1971 to about 1980 is the first section that we can see from this graph, where we have 2 peaks and 1 pretty low dip there. And it continues to do that. It continues to dip and peak and dip and peak. But as we move past the 80s into the 90s and the 2000s and onward, everything from basically 1982 through 2020 stays within a pretty typical region on this graph, hovering around about 8 to 10 chapters, with a little bit going above, some going below. And the numbers tell us exactly that. The highest amount outside of the first 3 years was 17 series canceled within a year, the lowest amount being 5, the median being 11, and the average being 9.3, so 9. Now, if we look all the way to 2020, we can see that there were 9 titles canceled in the magazine during 2020, which means that 2020 and 2019, for that matter, were both right there at the average of 9. And the majority of the past few decades have sat below that median level because the higher years were mostly in the first couple of decades, the first decade of the magazine's existence. So there's nothing different about the last few years of the magazine as far as the number of series canceled are. But that doesn't really give us all of the information that we want, because the year that has 5 canceled titles could have just been 6 titles that started in the magazine total, and the year that had 17 could have had like 30 total titles. We don't know, so I decided to go back and look at all the information again and find out how many titles were debuted in the magazine each year of its existence. I looked at the percentage of those titles that were canceled within a year of their debut, and that brought me to this second graph. Now this one, the first few years after 1968 kind of evens out, which, it makes sense with what I was saying, because there were a lot of titles that debuted in 1970, and that's why there were so many that were canceled. But we can see going through here, again, there's not a ton of variance. There's not a huge dip, there's not a huge rise. We can see that there are 2 pretty noticeable points, low points in the history of the magazine as far as the percentage. The lowest point being in 1990, and that was 42% of the titles that debuted that year were canceled within a year of their debut. The next low point was in 2004 at 50%, which was actually matched in 2020, another year that had 50%, because while 9 series were canceled in 2020, 18 total had debuted. So only 50% of those that debuted in 2020 had been canceled. Now the 2 dips in 90 and 2004, we can make an assumption that that's because of the number of popular long-running titles that were in the magazine at that time. But aside from that, there's not a lot of huge variance in the numbers here. We do have some peaks and we do have those low points, but for the most part, everything kind of stayed around that median. The median for the percentage is actually 66.5%, and the average percentage being 72%, which means that the average series has less than 30% chance of succeeding without being canceled within its first year, according to the history of the magazine. So once again, we have something else telling us that 2020 was below average. 2019, 2018, these were a little bit above average, but there was, if we look at the selection of basically the 2000s onward, the last several years kind of stay within the standard deviance of that period of the magazine. But there's one last thing that I want to look at that's really going to bring together all the information and tell us everything that we need to know to kind of make a decision on what we see from the magazine and whether the past couple years were weird or typical. And that's, what is the average chapter that we see these series being canceled at. So I went through all of this information again, every single series that was canceled within a year, and I found out what chapter each of these titles was canceled at. And that was a lot of work, but it did yield some pretty interesting information for this video. Going back to the beginning, all the way to now, you can see in this graph that there is kind of a rise. This is the only graph that shows any kind of actual change in the data. As we can see from the late 2000s going into the 2010s, that there was a rise in the number of chapters that we would see each of the series have as they were getting canceled. And then it dips, and then it starts to rise again, and we reached a peak actually in 2019. 2019 is the highest average chapter that we've seen. In the entire history of the magazine, it had an average of 32. Of all the series that were canceled within a year, the average chapter that they were canceled at was 32, that's insane. The very next year, 2020, did drop back down to an average of 27, but 27 is still significantly above the total average for the entire publication of the magazine, because the total average was actually 19.5 chapters. 19.5 chapters is significantly below the 27 chapter mark that was the average cancellation of 2020. Now, of course, there were some dips there. 2016 went pretty low, and the lowest chapter on average per year was actually 13. There were years that went as low as 13 being the average chapter. That's because there were a lot of titles that were being canceled within the single digits, especially back in the early years of the magazine. The median chapter, though, is 22.5. So either way you cut it, looking at the average or the median, the past couple of years of the magazine have shown that series are actually lasting longer now than they did before. There are some titles that are getting canceled pretty quickly, but on average, it's not lower than was typical before. So with all of that information, what does that really tell us? What do we really get from that? Well, the past few years of the magazine are not weird at all. The number of series being canceled, the percentage of series being canceled, the chapter at which these series are being canceled on average, all this information is standard, if not above average, if not doing better now than the magazine had been doing in the past. Then why does it seem like that's not true? Why does it seem like so many titles are getting canceled and that they're getting canceled so early? It's because of a bias that's created by the exposure to the titles in the magazine. So what does that mean? The past couple years is the first time when every series in the magazine has been readily available for English readers legally to read as the series are being published. And that's never happened before. Even in the previous years that the Shonen Jump app has existed, not until about 2019, 2020, did we get to the point where every single series that's being published in the magazine was available to read on the app. And what that does is it gives that further exposure to the magazine as a whole. It gives a further exposure to what actually happens to everything in the magazine. If you look back at the early 2000s, back when Viz Media debuted the Shonen Jump line, and when they really started pushing these titles on English-speaking audiences, back when we were first exposed to series like One Piece, Bleach, Naruto, and all these other popular titles from the magazine, we were never exposed to every series that was in the magazine. We were only exposed to the select few that Viz Media believed would be successful, that they would actually turn profits if they introduced them to Western audiences. Now, there were plenty of titles that were in the magazines at the time that we didn't know about, and plenty of them were being canceled within just, 20 to 30 chapters of publication. But the average English-speaking reader had no idea, because they were only exposed to what they wanted us to be exposed to. Now, maybe you read via some less than legal means, or maybe you were curious like me and you looked into all the different titles that were in the magazine at the time because you were curious what else was being published alongside your favorite ongoing titles. And if you were one of these outliers, then you probably knew exactly what the data was going to say in this video. However, if you were the average person, it makes sense that you would think that more things are being canceled now because all the stuff that you were being exposed to previously were the long-running successful titles that got to run for 30, 40, 50, 70 volumes in some cases. And it would seem weird to you, knowing all these titles that make it into dozens of volumes, that something would make it to barely a dozen chapters. Weekly Shonen Jump is just a cutthroat magazine where there's literally a 70% plus chance that your title is going to get canceled before it's even reached a year of publication. So with a 30% survival rate, how is a new creator supposed to actually make a successful series in Weekly Shonen Jump? Well, most creators don't succeed until their second or third try. Yeah, there are examples of those who get a hit right off the bat, but the number of well-known creators who had to make 2 or 3 different series before actually landing something that would last for longer than a year is significant. Going through every single series that was in the magazine, and every single of one of these that were canceled early, there were a lot of familiar names. Hiroyuki Takei, Tite Kubo, Masakazu Katsura, Masami Kurumada, Kohei Horikoshi, and one creator who actually had multiple titles that were canceled early before finally hitting it with a big series was Takeshi Obata. Obata had like 4 or 5 titles that were canceled soon after their debut before he hit it big with Hikaru no Go. And even after Hikaru no Go, he's had multiple titles that didn't quite hit as well. Between his larger series, like Hikaru no Go, Death Note, Bakuman, and Platinum End, he's had plenty of series that have not succeeded, that have been canceled within a few volumes worth of material. And he has a current ongoing series right now, and honestly, chances are it probably won't make it either. Which goes to show that as well, not only is it rookies that wind up seeing their series get canceled, but veteran creators wind up getting canceled from the magazine all the time. In fact, just in recent memory, we've seen a few such examples. Shimabukuro, who's known for Toriko, had Build King, which only lasted 20 chapters before getting canceled. Masashi Kishimoto, of course from Naruto, had Samurai 8, which lasted for 5 volumes worth of material. Even the series that I mentioned earlier in the video, Hard-Boiled Cop and Dolphin, was by the creator of Beelzebub. And while Beelzebub never really got popular in the States, it was hugely popular in Japan. The point being that at the end of the day, Weekly Shonen Jump is just a cutthroat magazine where it's hard to survive. There is literally a 70+% that you are going to be canceled within the first year of publication. It doesn't matter if you're a rookie, it doesn't matter if you were the assistant to whoever the top creator in the magazine is at the time, it doesn't matter if your previous series was a top-selling series in the magazine at the time. You are still just as likely as your neighbor in the magazine to be canceled within the first year of publication. So while it might seem odd that so many titles are getting canceled early in the Weekly Shonen Jump magazine right now, it's actually not odd at all. And if anything, things are trending into a more positive direction that could actually make it easier for creators to have successful series in the magazine. And right now, there are even more avenues for that success, where we've started to see more series get published in digital magazines like Jump Plus and have great success, like Spy Family and Kaiju Number 8. So the next time a series that you love gets canceled within 20 chapters, don't worry, it's not strange. Things are still going just as they always have in the magazine, and don't worry because that creator of that series could be back with something bigger and something better and something that succeeds and becomes the next big thing. So don't give up on your favorite creators. Just because they've had a series or two that's gotten canceled early does not mean that they should give up hope, and it doesn't mean that you should give up hope either as a fan of their work. Keep supporting the work that they publish, and hopefully one day they will find success in the magazine. So what do you think about all of this? I've put down all this information, and I've put down the proof that the magazine has pretty much always been this way, with a little bit of fluctuation here and there. But how does that make you feel? Do you think the magazine is too harsh on creators, or should they just continue doing things the way that they always have? I'm interested in everyone else's opinions on this, so please let me know what you think in the comments down below. As always, I hope that this was a very informative video, but as well, I hope that you had a good time and were entertained in watching it. If you're new to my channel and you like this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button and hit the bell so you're notified of all the other awesome videos I put out every week. And with that, I'll see you all in the next one. Peace out.